Hello. Today we're going to be discussing the 7th chapter of Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric. This chapter follows on from the 6th, where Aristotle described utility, or what he deemed, or what the speaker deems when addressing the audience, is productive of the good, or the end. And that chapter opened with a discussion of, or an intimation to, what Aristotle truly believes are the fundamental, foundational values that humanity should pursue, those being things like courage, magnificence, generosity, justice, kindness, and so forth. But in the latter part of the chapter, through examples, Aristotle shows that actually you can make an argument for pretty much anything and any virtue, or even any vice. And he concludes that when you're addressing your audience, you should determine what it is they value and shape your arguments around that. Now that is very rhetorical as opposed to dialectic, because that's driving at persuading your audience to do something by appealing to their desires, whether or not they truly should do that thing under the universal natural moral law. Now in the 7th chapter, Aristotle continues this discussion of political or deliberative rhetoric. Specifically, he addresses the question of relative utility. And again here you see echoes of the utilitarian theory that is foundational to game theory, economics, computer science, and so forth today. Relative utility is basically when you're arguing for one of two proposals or one of two actions, and you're deciding which is more good, which is better, even if they're both good. How can you tell which one is better? And to address this question, Aristotle involves a bit of mathematics. So he says, the greater or more is always implies the comparability to the small or the little, and the same with the many and the few. So to use those words when describing two courses of actions, it implies comparability. It implies that those things are commensurable and they're reducible to the same fundamental units, in the same way that you can compare the weights of something, or you can compare the wavelengths of different colours, but you cannot compare sound with vision, for example, or you cannot compare two units that measure fundamentally different things to each other. You need to reduce them to the atomic level, so to speak. When you're applying this to rhetoric, you're deciding what is the value you want to weigh your actions on, and that value in general is at the behest of the speaker. And also when you're comparing two actions, using that value as a scale, the one that is more productive of that good is seen to be better in Aristotle's eyes. When you're talking about populations, Aristotle has some interesting comments on making general comparisons between populations, which are actually quite inflammatory in today's context. He says one population is greater than another, not if the average of the population is bigger than the other on a given measure, say height, but if the greatest of that population is greater than the greatest of the other population. And he uses height as an example in relation to gender. He said men are in general taller than women, because the tallest man is taller than the tallest woman. And I thought that was an interesting point in Aristotle. The second thing is to do with coexistence or correspondences. So he says one quality is greater than another if the other quality always accompanies the quality in question, but not the converse. So taking life and health as an example, life is greater than health because whenever health is present, so is life. But whenever life is present, health isn't necessarily present. And this is a foundational idea in probability theory. And he also uses the example of knowledge and learning and sacrilege and cheating. Finally, Aristotle discusses proximate versus fundamental values. So he uses bodily strength as an example. So we pursue bodily strength in and of itself. It's desirable in and of itself, according to Aristotle. But what is wholesome, whatever that means, isn't, because we choose what is wholesome for the sake of other things. And I guess that also applies to money. Money is good insofar as it can provide or give us access to other things, but money in and of itself is not good because it is fundamentally a contingent concept and technology. In the temporal sense, analogously, the beginning is seen to be better than the end, because the beginning precedes the end and the beginning causes the end, and is the first mover, which is a concept in theology. So we should put priority over beginnings rather than ends. So these are some of the foundational moral assumptions or concepts Aristotle is using, and most of them do ring true. Now he talks about how you can apply these in the sphere of argumentation for a given proposal. So if you have two sets of consequences from two proposals and you want to choose which is more important, you could maybe argue that one of the proposals is more important because it's a beginning, it has beginningness in its nature, whereas the other is more of a consequence or a phenomena arising from the beginning. So in the context of law, he says the example of Leodamus accusing Callistratus, so that the man who prompted the deed, the murder, is more guilty than the murderer or the assassin, because they were the cause, they set that chain of events into action. And I'd argue that's also the case. Aristotle says you could actually argue the converse if you wanted to. You could say that actually it's the doer who is more culpable, because without them doing it, the murder wouldn't have happened. And that, for me, is a rhetorical, fallacious argument, because the kind of culprit or the schemer could have just hired someone else to do the job. But Aristotle does show you here that you can argue either case, but it's up to the discerning individual to figure out which has sound logic and which is just sophistry. Aristotle talks about rarity, so we value the rare things more than the things that are easy to come by. We value gold more than iron, even though it's more useful. But you could argue that water is the best of things because it's more useful than gold. It's more useful than anything, in fact. But generally, the hard thing is better than the easy, and it's of course more admirable, as Aristotle mentioned in prior chapters. But you could argue that actually the easy thing is better because it's easy to do, it's what we wish it to be. We always wish things to be easy. No one wants things to be hard. Similarly, Aristotle, he discusses kind of things inhering qualities from their causes. So bad things come from bad causes, and good things come from good causes. And this is a concept in the Bible. You'll know a tree by the fruit it bears. So I guess it's a reverse, but it's a similar concept. And he also says that when you have two, so this is quite interesting. He says when you have two things and you agree that one's better than the other, the superiority of one thing is better than the superiority of another. So if you agree that sight is a better sense than smell, superiority of sight is preferable to superiority of smell. And he says love of friends is better than love of money, and so forth. And from that basic logic, you can make arguments for and against proposals. Similarly, the activities associated with something that is born of a superior branch of knowledge is superior to another. So, if we value one science or another, the activities that involved in that science are better than that of the other science. And this is a way to go back from phenomena to their causes to argue what's preferable or its opposite. Similarly, he argues that, I guess this is really where it's coming to, he argues that what would be preferred, or what is more desirable by people with understanding, is better, or what good people would choose is better. So a better thing is that which attracts to better men. So courage is better than strength, and that a greater good would be chosen by a better man, either absolutely or in virtue of his being better, which is very interesting. So he says a greater man would rather suffer wrong than do injustice. So that is interesting to make an argument. You could say, well, so and so would do this, therefore we should do that. It's an appeal to authority of sorts. And then he talks about pleasure. He says the pleasanter of two things is the better, since all things pursue pleasure. But then he says the type of pleasure also matters. We prefer a pleasure that's more unmixed with pain. So we'll prefer a pleasure that is desirable in itself, or is longer lasting. So these are some of the descriptions of relative utility and ideas of relative utility that Aristotle has discussed. And he closes that discussion and enters into another one where he talks about some rhetorical devices. So he mentions the fact that if you want to kind of create emphasis on the utility of a course of action, you can kind of define the consequences of that action. So he says that Meleager was roused to battle by the thought of all the horrors that light on the folk whose city is taken by foes, when they slaughter the men, when the burg is wasted with ravening flame, when strangers are hailing young children to thrall them, fair women to shame. So the idea is that piling up facts in a climax is almost summative, and that produces more of an effect than simply saying when the city is taken it will be disastrous. It's describing exactly what will happen there to evoke feeling. So combination and division makes the impression of great superiority, in the same way that if you divide a single block or a single cube into many items, it can look bigger. It can look more imposing if you spread them out. It covers more space. Aristotle also says that if you want to make something appear more impressive, you can appeal to its uniqueness in attaining things that it either shouldn't have done by virtue of its origins, or by virtue of the difficulty of what it's done in terms of the natural obstacles in its face, or supernatural obstacles even. And that can create a kind of effective contrast. And this is something that you see all the time in the media. His example is of a victor of the Olympic Games whose epigram was, "In times past, heaving a yoke on my shoulder of wood unshaven, I carried my loads of fish from Argos to Tegea town." So he's saying that, and politicians do this all the time, that he had very humble beginnings, carrying fish from place to place, and now he's an Olympic victor, an Olympic champion. And Homer also says, if Hippocrates extolled himself by describing the low state from which he'd risen, again, what is natural is better than what is inherited. So Homer says, I've learnt from none but myself. So stuff that we've done on our own without the assistance of others, it seems to be more impressive because it's more difficult. Okay. So this chapter really concludes with some very, very interesting illustrations by Aristotle. Just like the last chapter, he just launches into sentences which demonstrate how he can basically argue for anything. It's actually quite frightening in a way that he can do that, and kind of a warning to everyone that's reading argumentation from people that will actually lack scruples and will argue any case that suits them, regardless of the truth of the underlying topic. So Aristotle says that we may define what aims at appearance as what a man will not choose if nobody is to know of his having it. So appearance is what aims at appearance is all the show we put on solely for the sight of others. So things we do when we know we're being watched. And then he says, this would seem to show that to receive benefits is more desirable than to confer them, since the man will choose the former even if nobody's to know of it, but it is not the general view that he will choose the latter if nobody's to know of it. And he's saying that's better because what aims at reality is better than what aims at appearance. So this argument is interesting because everyone would agree that reality is better than appearance, but then would they agree with the argument that just receiving benefit is better than giving it? Because you cannot give benefit without others being there to witness your giving, but you can receive benefit without others being there. I'd even argue that's not even true. So look, this argument is problematic, but it does sound compelling at first glance. And then he says, hence men say that justice is of small value, since it is more desirable to seem just than to be just, whereas with health it is not so. So that's interesting because he's saying actually it's better to seem like you're a just person to others, in the eyes of others, But being just is less desirable because being just involves conferring benefits to others. But conferring benefits, according to his earlier argument, is something that aims at appearance. And of course that's false, because you can confer benefits without doing it with the intention that it is to be seen by others, or without the intention of receiving anything from it, and that's called kindness, which he describes in a prior chapter. So this is a very problematic argument that is compelling but requires some thought to unpick. And the end of the argument suggests that people should choose health over justice. They should choose the appearance of justice over doing justice, which, in mass, is a bad situation for society. Okay. So that's Aristotle's classic show rather than tell. And then another example he gives is things that which we are seen to possess are better than those which we are not seen to possess, since the former have an air of reality. So wealth may be regarded as a greater good if its existence is known to others. That which is dearly prized is better than that which is not. That sort of thing that some people have only one of, though others have more like it. So he says, blinding a one-eyed man inflicts worse injury than half blinding a man with two eyes. The one-eyed man has been involved with what he dearly prized. So that's interesting. It says if you want someone to feel as if something they own is really valuable, you need to make them feel like there isn't any more of it. You need to invoke a feeling of scarcity. And then if you threaten them that thing can be taken from them, you can invoke a feeling of fear. So this is very manipulative, dark stuff by Aristotle. And you can see how it could be problematic in the wrong hands. Let's maybe go over one more point that he makes here. So that is better than other things which is more useful than they are for a number of different purposes. For example, that which promotes life, good life, pleasure, and noble conduct. For this reason, wealth and health are commonly thought to be of the highest value. So this is kind of in stark contrast to the Platonic school of thought. He's saying the more physical things like wealth and health are the highest value because they propose life, good life, pleasure, and noble conduct. I'd say that feels kind of reasonable, but I'm not really sure that's an airtight argument. But that concludes chapter 8. Sorry, it's been a bit of a long video. Had a long day, but I thought this was an interesting chapter in describing how to make comparisons between things, but also in the concluding argument he makes against doing justice but seeming just as being better than actually doing justice, and preserving your health over doing justice, even if it means doing something cowardly to protect your health. I thought that was a shocking conclusion he came to, but he made that argument with the techniques that he described earlier in the chapter, and I don't think Aristotle actually believed that. I think he's just demonstrating to the reader what can be done with these techniques, and leaving it to the reader to figure out that may not actually be his beliefs, his real beliefs, and trusting that the reader won't use these techniques to mislead people. So that concludes the 8th chapter. Hopefully we can get to the 7th chapter. Hopefully we can get to the 8th chapter shortly. Thank you.